It is great to get a chance to talk with Steve Mathewson. He is a longtime pastor, longtime professor, currently an adjunct at Western Seminary and also Moody Theological Seminary. He has written several books, including the one that we're going to talk about today, The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. This has been a favorite of mine for a long time. It's now in an updated version. And I'm also proud to call you a friend, Steve. It's good to have you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks, Cisco. My privilege.
The first thing I want to throw at you is this is an updated book here that I have. This is not the original version. I have that on my shelf as well, but you originally wrote it in 2002, and now you've updated the book. What made you think this is a book that I need to update? Has something changed in Old Testament? Do we have different books or editions or something?
Well, the first edition turned out to be heretical, so they wanted me to get another run at it.
I'm glad they gave you another shot.
Yeah. Oh, no, seriously, my approach is still the same, but one thing I did add was a chapter on the Christ-centered preaching debate. I dealt with that basically well, at the end of the first book, I had some sample sermons and kind of interviewed each preacher, including myself. And I said a few things there, but I really didn't deal with that topic fully. And that's just become a bigger issue in evangelicalism over the years. So that was one impetus for it. The other was just to kind of tighten up, clean up some things. I use an acronym now uh, for talking about the different features that you look for, literary features when you're studying a narrative, so things like that. And then I had like five, I think it was five sample sermons at the back of the first edition, and they were good sermons, but that was 2002, and before there was so much stuff available on the internet, and so that just didn't seem to be as urgent. When the publisher asked me about doing a second edition, we talked about it and just felt like maybe one sample sermon would be sufficient, for me. And so, yeah, I feel good though. Sometimes, I don't know about you, Cisco, but I've purchased second editions, and turns out, wow, this second edition, maybe they changed five words. It doesn't seem like it really needed a second edition. But I feel good about this. I feel like I can tell people, yes, it really is worth getting the second edition, and it's been cleaned up and improved. So yeah, there you go.
Well, and I'm glad for the chapter on the Christocentric hermeneutic and just those challenges, the debates that are going on. Because you're right, if you're going to talk about any Old Testament book, you
Yeah.
need to talk about that issue, especially when it comes to interpretation, but also for preaching. So, give us kind of a thumbnail here, because I know you talk about the various views in the chapter. Do you take a particular position? Are you convinced that one take on how to do this is the correct take? Or how are you feeling about this, especially now that you studied it enough to write a whole chapter on it?
Sure. Yeah, I really do. One thing I noticed over the years is that there's been kind of two major views presented, and I think there's really a third, which is right in the middle. So you have the Christ-centered view, where hey, we're here to preach Christ. The other side would be the theocentric view. What's interesting, there's a really good book, and you might be, I know you're familiar with it, maybe you have your students read it, but the Homiletics and Hermeneutics book, and they have a theocentric view, and then they have a Christoconic view. Well, they're the same view, really. Ken Langley, a friend of mine, did the theocentric, and then let's see, Abe Curavella, I can call him Abe because he's a friend too. He did the Christoconic view, which is really I kind of have to laugh. It's kind of the non-Christ centered view, because he says that you just preach what's there. You preach the theology of the text, and then the Spirit of God will use that to conform you to the image, Greek word icon, hence Christoconic, to the image of Christ. So really, it's all the same view. So it's kind of, on one hand, you've got the Christ-centered. On the other hand, you've got the theocentric. You want to call it Christoconic. I think there's a mediating view, and my fancy label for that is Christocentric slash theocentric. I suppose you could call it Christotelic, and what it does is it says, you know what, there's something to both views. I do think that we really have to work hard on understanding the theological message of the writer, and we've got to go back and look at the literary cues and understand the message that was given in that particular context to that first audience. We have to start there. But then I don't think we need to stop there. I think we need to look at that narrative or the message. How does that fit into the larger storyline of the Bible, of which Christ is the hero? And we would call that biblical theology. And I know Abe Kuruvilla in his book Privilege the Text says, well, we sermon's not the place to do biblical theology. We really don't have time to do that. But I think we do. I think we can without skewing the original theological message, or without taking so much time that we don't have time to develop it. So I guess I want to have my cake and eat it too, but I think one leads to the other. I don't think they have to be pitted against each other. And really, a lot of good preachers that I hear who call themselves one or the other end up doing both anyway.
Yeah, the fear. It seems like both sides take their position. I mean, they'll take it based on their conviction that it's the best way to
Hmm.
handle the text. But there are also these fears of either not preaching Christ or not getting to the heart of a particular text. There's this fear of moralism or legalism, that
Yeah.
if we're just preaching, Abe
Hmm.
Kuruvilla's phrase is the divine demands of Scripture. If we're
Right.
just preaching the
Hmm.
divine demands, then we're going to get these little legalists or moralists. Is it really as bad as either side makes it out to be? Are their fears really warranted? Or if you handle the text well, can you avoid those extremes?
Yeah, exactly. I think if you handle the text well, you can easily avoid those. And uh, I remember Tim Keller saying, writing as a Christ-centered preacher, saying, we can't be afraid to preach those divine demands, and that's not moralizing. Fact, and I include this in the book, but I remember a number of years ago watching a video of R.C. Sproul interviewed Don Carson, D.A. Carson, and I think they were talking about canonical interpretation, and D.A. Carson said, uh, one of the problems is that a lot of pastors, when they preach these narratives in the Old Testament, they'll talk about, well, David did this and we ought to do this, or David didn't do this and we shouldn't do this. And he said, but then eventually they learn that there are some trajectories here, and that you're preaching about David, that there's a Davidic dynasty. Actually, Don Carson would say Davidic dynasty, and he says that they're drawing these lines, from David to Christ. But then he said something fascinating. He said, but then they forget that there's moral categories in Scripture, and that the writer of James is free to say that Elijah prayed and it rained, and we ought to be like Elijah. So even Don Carson, who I think we would associate with that Christ-centered view, would, or has said you do both. And so I don't think one precludes the other. I think you're right. If we're handling the text well, we don't have to be afraid about, you know, whatever the concern might be. We don't have to be afraid of moralizing on the one side, or we don't have to be afraid of missing Christ. We can preach the theology, the text, but then, yeah, show how how that theological idea fits into the larger storyline. And sometimes that might mean showing how a text points forward to, say, to Jesus, especially if it's David. I mean, Jesus being the son of David, that's a natural movement, but we don't bypass the text, and we don't have to find, Jesus behind every bush. And so I'm finding that I think more scholars and more preachers are saying that. Christopher Wright is one who says that in his book, How to Preach the Bible for All It's Worth.
Hmm.
So yeah, you can do both without sacrificing.
So those Old Testament texts, as we're preaching them, I'm thinking preaching methodology, philosophy, however you'd say it, is some of this helped by preaching through books of the Bible, where if you're preaching through Judges or if you're preaching through First or Second Samuel or both, you, as the regular preacher, have the opportunity. There's an ebb and flow. I'm going to make some of these connections to Christ, to redemptive history,
Mhm.
to the eternal kingship. But then maybe next week, because of the way the text is laid out, I'm going to encourage us to live in a certain way in light of what's going on in the text. We have an
Right.
opportunity for both if we do that.
Sure. Yeah, I think we really do. And we're always wanting to say, look, whatever this text is demanding, and just to back up, I think it's really instructive that a big chunk of narrative in the Old Testament are in what the Jewish canon classifies as the former prophets. So that would be Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, which is six big books in our English Bibles. And so that's giving a prophetic message. And even as Gordon Wenham's book story is Torah, I mean, Torah means instruction. We often translate that too quickly as law, but Torah is instruction. And so, the narratives in Genesis and Exodus, those are instructions. So, yeah, there's nothing at all, wrong with preaching that instruction, and we should do that. Now, then, back to your question. Yeah, we take that message, and we always have to tell people the only way that you can carry out the demand of this text, the divine demand, to use Abe Caravilla's language, is through the gospel, through the power of Christ and His Spirit. So, if nothing else, that becomes our link. Sometimes we'll talk about how this kind of this story or this motif, works its way through the Old Test or through Scripture, through Old and New Testament, and it is a theme, and yet, yeah, there might be some other passages where we point forward to Jesus and say this anticipates Jesus, and Jesus is the better David, but I don't find myself doing the better. Jesus is the better David or the better Moses, every week. I think there's a number of different ways that we can locate a narrative in its larger story of which Christ is the hero.
Let's talk about narrative in general. And I want to see you have Old Testament narrative, you have New Testament narrative. Obviously, the book is about Old Testament narrative.
Mhm.
In general, would you say a story is a story is a story when it comes to interpreting and preaching? Are there differences that you see as we're looking at the Old Testament that might be different than, for example, if we're preaching a gospel story, a gospel narrative, or Acts or something?
Sure. I think overall there's so much similarity. I mean, yeah, a story is a story is a story. You're dealing with plot, you're dealing with characters, you're listening to the dialogue. And in the case of the gospel narratives, it's Jesus talking, and then you're paying attention to the setting, both historical, cultural, but even the literary setting, and so those are all important. I've been reading recently. Janine Brown has a terrific book called "The Gospel as Stories," and I found this really helpful for New Testament narrative. And it's interesting. She goes through and talks about plot and plotting, then character and characterization, then intertextuality, which how these texts kind of fit together, which you're doing in Old Testament, and I find there's a lot of the same overlap. I've wondered this. I do notice the gospel writers seem to put sometimes two, often three stories together that will they hold together on their own, but when you put them together, they seem to make a larger point. And I've wondered if that's, I'm not sure that's quite as prominent in Old Testament narrative. Maybe I need to think that through a little bit. Maybe it is. But it seems like that might be one difference. Um, yeah, I'm sure there's some other, maybe some micro differences. I know there are, but I think overall, yeah, a lot of the things that we learn as we work on Old Testament narratives, that's going to apply to the Gospels. In fact, what's interesting, even in Matthew's Gospel, it's kind of recognized as the most Jewish of all the three synoptic Gospels. And what you find is even the structure, kind of the clause structure, is the same as in Hebrew narrative, where you have, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and then every once in a while you'll get that kind of the old King James language is, and it came to pass, or, and it so happened. Well, that's really reflective of Hebrew narrative. So that's one place where even the narrative structure is very similar to the Old Testament.
In the book, when you talk about what we should look at as we're examining the Old Testament narrative, you use this acronym. I think it's very helpful. ACTS. You get into a lot of detail about
Mhm.
it, chapter by chapter in the book. Give us just a quick thumbnail of those four things that we're going to be looking at and examining whenever we're in Old Testament narrative.
Sure, and that's an acronym that I used, or yeah, kind of developed for edition number two. I didn't change the details, but that kind of helps me to group those things. So action, the A would be action. So ACTS is an acronym. Think of the acts in a play. Well, the A is action, or plot, and I'm really glad the word started with an A, or I suppose it could have started with a P. Then I would use the word plot, because there's a lot of agreement by Old Testament scholars who work in narrative that these narratives are really plot driven primarily. So we always want to look at the plot, and basically, there's two main elements of the plot, but I'll give you four. The first one is what literary scholars call exposition, which we would say, well, this is kind of the background information you need to set up a story. And of course, that's horribly confusing, because we call our approach to preaching exposition. We're unpacking, we're exposing, working through a text of scripture. But in literary terms, exposition is really what you need, the background, so you're ready for the story. Well, then the story moves into a crisis, and that's a key part of the story, is the crisis. Now, that can be a series of crises, and then you get resolution, which that can also be a series of resolutions. In fact, sometimes literary scholars talk about rising tension. So you can have rising tension. Here's your crisis. It's rising, and then, phew, there's some relief, and then it happens again, and there's more relief, and that can go on. But eventually, there's resolution to the story, whether it's a happy ending or a sad ending. Happy endings, literary scholars call comedy, and that's not Stephen Colbert humor. It's comedy. Comic structure would be. Kind of think of a U-shaped plot where it starts in prosperity, descends to tragedy, but then it makes that turnaround back up to prosperity. So that's comic structure. So you have happy endings, but then you also have sad endings where the story starts in prosperity and it just goes down to tragedy, and that's where it stops. Now the story may be resolved, and we think of some of those stories of King Saul and 1 Samuel 15, where he's finally rejected by the Lord. I mean, that's tragic. There's resolution, but it's tragic. So then some stories have a fourth element that literary scholars call a denouement. I guess you have to use a big French word to charge tuition, but a denouement kind of looks like denouement. It's Denouvent. I just like to call it a conclusion. So there you go. There's a
So
big
much
sales
easier,
word.
isn't
Yeah,
it?
it really is. So yeah, just conclusion. Uh, and not every story has that, but sometimes you'll have that in a verse. Sometimes you'll have that in a paragraph or so. But again, you're always looking at that kind of the crisis and resolution. That's what really drives a story. So that would be the A. Then the C would be characters, and a lot of different ways that you could analyze characters, but we're just trying to see, okay, who are the main characters? How do they relate to each other? I think classically we've used terms like protagonist or antagonist, and I don't even worry about the literary terms so much, but how do they relate to each other? Foil is another one. But I give you an example, like in 1 Samuel 17, which we commonly call the story of David and Goliath. And I'm not on a crusade to change the way we refer to that, but in a lot of respects, it's really the story of David versus Saul. And it's in a section of the narrative where the writer's showing us that David is more qualified to be king than Saul. And that's important because in the ancient Near East, you don't just interrupt the ruling dynasty, the family of rule. You have to, if that happens, you better build a case. And that's what the writer does, that David's the right choice. So it's really David versus Saul, and Goliath becomes the challenge that exposes both of them. So that's the kind of thing you want to do with characters. Just look at how they relate to each other. Look at how they grow and how they develop. All right, then you come to, and there's more to say on that, but you can you can
If,
read
if you if
people
you, if
can
you
read the
give us
book.
too much, yeah, I know if they give it too much, they don't have to buy the book, right?
That wouldn't be good, right? So, all right, then the T stands for a highly technical word called talking. Uh, yeah, I think back in the days of Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative, he just referred to it as dialogue, but it's what the characters say. And that's really important for a number of reasons. I won't give them all, so people still get the book. But one of them is that that's often where you get big clues as to what the big idea of a story is, and so that dialogue's important. By the way, it struck me one day reading 1 Samuel 15 that the story is so well told that you don't realize that three-fourths of it is simply dialogue. So that becomes important to analyze that. And then the final one, the S, would be setting. And that's both what we would call the historical cultural setting. That's important in any kind of literature, but especially the literary setting. Where does this occur? And I just alluded to that with 1 Samuel 17. This is in a section that's arguing that David is more qualified than Saul to be king. In fact, Saul's not qualified at all. And understanding that literary setting, I think, really helps us understand what's going on in that narrative.
So talk to new preachers who are just studying Old Testament narrative. Maybe they've read it before, but now they're thinking about processing it, interpreting it for preaching. You spend time in each of these items, the action, the characters, the talking, the setting. How do you then work through all of the material you've gathered, everything that you've analyzed, and say, this is the big idea, the theological truth, whatever terminology you want to use. This is what God is saying in this text, and this is what I need to preach to my
Mhm.
people. A lot of times there's just so much stuff, so many papers, and it's
Yeah.
it's tough to now know. Okay, so what do I do now with this stuff?
hmm Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really one of the reasons why I titled my book The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. Now, it is a tip of the cap to Robert Alter's book, The Art of Biblical Narrative. I mean, that's where I really first learned how to interpret, the narrative literature of the Old Testament. But I do think that, yeah, that concept is helpful to think about this as art. There may be a science to it as well, but we have to have a literary feel for these stories. And one of the things I tell people when you work with this ACTS acronym, and you learn to look for those different elements of the plot, that eventually that'll be second nature, and you won't have to stop, and you won't have to say, okay, what's going on with the action or plot, what's going on with the characters, what's going on with the talking, what's going on with the setting. you kind of put that together intuitively and do what we do as readers of a story. So I think yeah, you might have pages of material, but again, I think this is where it's important to synthesize, just to simply say, okay, what's the crisis? How is it resolved? And how do these characters relate? Are there any speeches, any talking that seems to reflect, what that main idea might be, and where does this happen in the larger narrative? And I think if you put those together, it doesn't have to be too complicated. A couple of other steps along the way that I learned from my mentor, Haddon Robinson. He said, when you move from your exegesis, all those details, and you're trying to formulate, what's that exegetical idea? What's that big idea? He said, ask yourself, what's the vision of God in this text? In other words, what's the character quality of or attribute of God that seems to be the issue here? And that really helps to narrow your focus. And then the other side is, what about the depravity factor? And I think in his later edition of his book, he calls that the human factor, the human condition, a little bit like Brian Chappell's fallen condition focus. Maybe they're not exact, but there's a lot of overlap. And what Haddon Robinson said is, so what's the sin that this passage seems to speak to? Why do we need this challenge? Where is it that we're tempted to go wrong? And if you can figure that out, then that'll help you take some of those details and make more sense of them and formulate that big idea.
When it comes to putting the sermon together, I'm thinking structurally as an outline, you're trying to decide how to preach this.
Hmm.
We often, especially when we're dealing with epistles, we often want to structure a sermon where it begins with some sort of a story that kind of brings us into the big idea. Not everyone preaches that way,
Yeah.
but a lot of us
Hmm.
do. But when it comes to these Old Testament narratives, since we're preaching stories, do we structure it in that way, bringing kind of an outside story into the story, or when you're preaching this, do you just start with what David or Samuel are doing?
That's an insightful question. I'm really glad you asked that because I have strong opinions about that. I don't think it's best to start with another story. Let's not compete with the biblical story. I do think we need an introduction. I think a good introduction creates interest. It raises a need for the sermon, and then it orients listeners to the biblical text. But I think we can do that. I try to do that more quickly in narrative than I do maybe in other kinds of literature because I really want to get into that story. And we don't need a long 5 minute or 7 minute introduction. Um, raise that issue, whether it's a quote or just saying, just talking about human life, what people are dealing with, and saying, there's a story, there's a narrative in the Old Testament that really helps us deal with this issue or answer this question, and then and then off you go.
And get right into it because these stories are so rich. I mean,
Yeah, they are.
tell them in a way that's really compelling and really
It's
bring the
true,
detail
and
out.
I think it goes for illustrations as well. This is not the place to say, um, you know, Taylor Swift had an incident in her life where, da 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 da, or, Abraham Lincoln, whoever it happens to be. And you might have a great story. Save that for other kinds of literature. I don't think we need to introduce a narrative with a story, nor do I think we need to illustrate with a story. In fact, when it comes to illustrations and narrative, I think they usually need to be pretty brief, and maybe they're more analogies than anything. Yeah.
Last thing, I just want to get your opinion. I've never asked you about this. Your opinion on first person narrative messages. Do those help? Do they distract? What in general are your thoughts on that? And for those who don't know, first person narratives are when you take on a character and sort of preach the sermon from the perspective of that character.
Yeah, I'm a fan of first person narratives. I think they can really help. And I think a lot of people who have even written, who've been practitioners, but then written on it, like Kent Edwards or Torrey Robinson with his dad Haddon. I mean, they say you can't overuse these. And maybe in some settings you might have people who push back a little bit. Well, that's not preaching. Like, okay, whatever. I think it can be, even theologically. I mean, if Ezekiel could lay on his side and build Legos and use that to make a point, then I don't have a problem with the first person narrative. But one thing that I've done, and I've encouraged my students to do, is even if you're planning on preaching this as a normal third person, you're just telling the story, practice it as a first person, and that'll help you get into the storytelling mode. Because one thing I'm really convinced of, when we preach a narrative, we have to do more than retell the story. I get it, but we cannot do less. And the last thing we want to do is to make it sound like a lecture. And sometimes, especially with newer preachers, those who are just learning, and especially if you've learned how to preach the epistles first and you come to a narrative, it's really hard to break into that storytelling mode. And what I find is that if you use a first person, even just to practice it that way, it kind of brings out the storyteller in you. Besides, there's been a few people over the years who've criticized first person, say, well, that's kind of fluff. Actually, I think if you use the first person format, you can get away with a lot more historical cultural background information than you ever could in a regular sermon structure, because you're telling it as a story. By the way, that's the other thing I always tell my students when you're preaching, and this is getting a little bit beyond first person, but I want to say this. Never say, before we look at the story, let me give you a little background. I mean, what a snoozer. That's just that good storytellers don't do that. What I say is just take that little bit of background and tell it as part of the story, and people really, they're on the edge of their seat listening to that. So yeah, we've always have to practice good storytelling skills, and I find that first person approach, yeah, use it occasionally. Maybe, I don't know. There's no the Bible doesn't tell us how often, but a lot of communicators say, yeah, maybe do it a couple times a year. If you do it too often, it could get a little bit old. But even beyond that, practice it that way. If you're having trouble telling a story narrative, just practice it as a first person, and that'll really help.
Yeah, I'm tracking with you. I found doing first person early on in my preaching career helped me to be more specific with my language,
Yeah.
more creative, more descriptive, just to really paint a picture better, even when I am preaching third person, and even when I'm preaching other genre of literature, when I'm preaching
Yes.
from
Yeah.
epistles or
Hmm.
something. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Steve, such good stuff. Man, I appreciate you spending time with us. Again, the book is The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. This is the second edition. First one was great. It was well marked up on my shelf. And now this one is too. You can see my notes there, and there's highlights all throughout it. Just really, really helpful as we want to be able to preach God's
Good.
word faithfully. So thanks for all your work on this, and thanks for
Oh,
spending some
you're
time with
you're
me.
welcome. Thank you, Cisco. It's been a privilege to talk with you today.